The scent was the first lie. Lilies. Of course, it had to be lilies. They stood in ostentatious, funereal white arrangements on either side of the two closed caskets, their fragrance thick and cloying, a sweet, heavy blanket intended to smother the stark reality of the room. It was the scent of manufactured sorrow, a perfume for a grief that wasn't there. I sat on the stiff velvet of the front row chair, my back a ramrod, my hands resting calmly in the lap of my black wool dress. I could feel the gazes upon me, the peripheral dance of concerned glances and hushed whispers. Poor Lily, she must be in shock. So stoic, her heart must be broken. They told me it was shock. Numbness. I nodded, a small bird-like dip of my head that I had perfected over 80 years of polite agreement. It was a useful mask. But it wasn't numbness. It was a terrifying crystalline clarity, the kind of clarity that comes after a fever breaks, leaving the world sharp-edged and brutally defined. I wasn't mourning the parents I lost on a rain-slicked highway 2 days ago. I was mourning the parents I never had, the ones who had died for me 50 years ago, not in a wreck of steel and glass, but in the sterile silence of a sunlit living room. The room was a theater of bereavement. Cousins I hadn't seen in a decade dabbed at dry eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. My father's old business partners stood in a somber cluster, their faces arranged in masks of respectable gravity. They spoke in low, reverent tones about Richard Quinn's integrity, his business acumen, his unwavering sense of honor. The word hung in the air, as thick and cloying as the scent of the flowers. Honor. I felt a cold, smooth stone settle in the pit of my stomach. Their Richard Quinn was a fictional character, a carefully constructed protagonist in a story they had all agreed to believe. My mother, Helen, was his tragic, beautiful leading lady. In their version of the play, she was a woman of grace and fragility, devoted to her family and her husband. They remembered her garden parties, her perfectly decorated home, her quiet, unwavering support of her husband's ambitions. A woman with a cloud of blue-rinsed hair and a face like a worried prune gripped my arm. A third cousin, perhaps. Martha, or was it Mildred? The names, like the faces, blurred into a single meaningless tapestry of obligation. "Oh, Lily, dear," she breathed, her voice a reedy sigh. "Your mother was such a wonderful woman, so elegant. I always admired her strength. The word was a slap. I thought of my mother's strength. It wasn't the strength of a pillar, but of a locked door. The strength of denial, the strength to look at her own child's anguish and see only the threat of social inconvenience. I saw her face, not as the world saw it, soft and melancholic, but as I remembered it from a lifetime ago, pale, tight with panic, her eyes darting away, unable to meet mine. "Thank you, Martha," I said, my voice even. "That's kind of you to say." She patted my hand, satisfied with my performance of a grieving daughter, and drifted away to join the chorus of hushed remembrances. My gaze drifted to the 2 caskets at the front of the room, polished cherry wood, gleaming under the soft artificial lights. Identical. A matching set. It was exactly as they would have wanted. Orderly, respectable, and perfectly symmetrical, even in death. The highway patrolman had said it was quick. A patch of black ice on a winding country road. They were returning from a dinner at their country club. Instantaneous, he'd assured my brother, Mark, on the phone. No suffering. A blessing, really. Everyone called it a tragedy, but the word felt wrong. A tragedy requires a fall from a great height, a flaw in a noble character. What was this? A final, tidy conclusion to a long, meticulously curated narrative. There was no flaw to be found, because the entire structure was a lie. There was no great height, only a carefully maintained facade. I looked at the boxes that held the bodies of Richard and Helen Quinn, and I felt nothing. Not the searing anger of my youth. Not the hollow ache of my middle years. Just a profound and unnerving stillness. The end of a long, cold war that had been waged in silence. A war I had lost before I even understood I was a soldier. They had been the architects of my life, drawing the blueprints of my existence with a cold, steady hand. My father, with his unbending will and his obsession with the family name, was the director. My mother, with her porcelain fragility and her terror of gossip, was his most devoted actress. Their marriage, I had long suspected, was the centerpiece of this performance, a union not of passion, but of strategic alliance. They were a united front, the respectable Mr. and Mrs. Quinn of Havenwood, Oregon, and I, their daughter, had been their greatest, most terrible secret. A heavy hand landed on my shoulder. I didn't need to look to know it was my brother. Mark had always moved with the unthinking confidence of a man for whom the world had always made way. Even now, in his late 50s, with a receding hairline and the soft paunch of a life lived comfortably, he still carried himself like the golden boy quarterback he had once been. He leaned down, his breath warm and smelling faintly of coffee and anxiety. His whisper was meant to be comforting, conspiratorial, the voice of an ally. "Lily," he murmured, his eyes scanning the room, checking the audience. "People are starting to notice. You haven't shed a tear." I said nothing, my eyes fixed on the gleaming cherry wood. He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of impatient affection. "I know this is hard, but you need to show something. For appearances. Just try to look the part." There it was. The phrase, the two words that had been the operating manual for my entire childhood. The justification for every closed door, every averted gaze, every unspoken truth. For appearances. It was the Quinn family motto, more sacred than any commandment. It wasn't a request for genuine emotion. It was a stage direction. He didn't need me to feel grief. He needed me to perform it. He was the new director of the play, and I was missing my cue. The words didn't ignite the old rage. Instead, they were like a key, turning a final, rusty lock deep inside me. The stillness I felt wasn't emptiness after all. It was resolve. A cold, hard, and perfectly formed resolve that had been 50 years in the making. The clarity sharpened, and for the first time, I saw the path forward not as a continuation of silence, but as a final, quiet demolition. I turned my head slowly and looked at my brother. I looked at his face, etched with a genuine, if shallow, concern for the family brand. He saw a stoic, grieving sister. He had no idea that he was looking at a stranger. He had no idea of the country that existed behind my eyes, the one he had never been granted a visa to enter. "The part?" I repeated, my voice so low he had to lean in closer. "You know," he insisted, "the grieving daughter." I gave him the smallest, most inscrutable of smiles. It didn't reach my eyes. "Don't worry, Mark," I said, my voice as calm and smooth as polished stone. "I will play my part." He nodded, relieved, and straightened up, his duty as the family's emotional stage manager complete. He moved away to shake the hand of the mayor, leaving me alone in the front row. I turned my attention back to the caskets. A performance. He wanted a performance. After all these years, it was still all they wanted from me. Very well. The story they would get wouldn't be the one they expected. It would not be a tragedy in 2 acts, ending here in this room fragrant with lies. It would be an epic, spanning decades. It would be a story of a quiet, picturesque town, a beloved teacher, and a family's honor. It would be a confession, and it would begin not with these 2 polished boxes of wood, but in a sunlit classroom 50 years ago, with a man everyone in Havenwood called a saint. The performance was about to begin. But this time, I would be the one writing the script. My brother's words, for appearances, hung in the stale, flower-choked air long after he had moved away. They were not an anchor to the present, but a hook, pulling me back through the silent, murky waters of half a century. The scent of funeral lilies faded, replaced by something else, something I hadn't smelled in years, the clean, dusty aroma of chalk, the papery breath of old books, and the faint, sharp tang of industrial floor polish. The muffled sobs of my cousin Martha dissolved into the remembered, distant ringing of a school bell, a sound that once marked the beginning of my only sanctuary. The performance they wanted from me now was a pale shadow of the one that began then, in the sun-drenched autumn of my 16th year, in a town that was itself the grandest performance of all. Havenwood, Oregon, back in those days, was a masterpiece of American self-deception. It was a town lifted from a painter's canvas, a place of impossible, aggressive wholesomeness. Every lawn on Maple Street, including ours, was a perfect manicured green carpet. The white picket fences were not just boundaries, they were declarations of tidy, respectable lives. In the town square, a quaint gazebo stood sentinel over brick pathways, and a granite war memorial listed the names of boys who had died honorably, their sacrifice woven into the town's founding myth. Shopkeepers on Main Street knew your name and your parents' names and would ask after your grades with a smile that was both friendly and evaluative. It was a beautiful cage, intricately wrought and gilded with good intentions. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the unspoken rules. Reputation was the local currency, and my father, Richard Quinn, was one of its wealthiest men. Our house was the physical embodiment of my father's ambition. It sat, perfectly symmetrical, behind a row of meticulously trimmed hedges. Inside, there was no clutter. My mother, Helen, saw to that. Her life was a constant, anxious battle against disorder, both physical and social. Surfaces gleamed. The silence was deep, broken only by the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall or the polite clinking of silverware against china at precisely 6:30 every evening. It was at the dinner table that the daily performance of the Quinn family was staged. My father would sit at the head, the stern patriarch, reviewing the day's events as if they were a corporate balance sheet. "Mark," he'd say, his voice carrying the weight of pronouncements, "hear you scored the winning touchdown. The Hendersons were talking about it at the club. Good work. Makes the family name proud." My brother Mark would flush with pleasure, mumbling a thank you as he shoveled mashed potatoes into his mouth. He was built for that world. His achievements were loud, physical, and easy to applaud. A touchdown. A student council election. They were victories that could be announced in the local paper, trophies that could be displayed on the mantelpiece. Then, my father's gaze would shift to me. "Lily, your report card." It was not a question, but a demand for data. "All A's, Father," I'd say quietly. He would nod, a curt, dismissive gesture. "Good. Keep it that way." There was no talk of what I was reading, no curiosity about the essays I wrote that earned those A's. My achievements were silent, internal, and therefore less valuable. They were lines on a piece of paper, not points on a scoreboard. My mother would watch these exchanges with a tight, nervous smile. Her only contribution to the conversation, a gentle admonishment if one of us placed our elbows on the table. She was the guardian of the family's image, the curator of its fragile perfection. Her greatest fear was a crack in the facade, a stain on the tablecloth, a stray piece of gossip that might attach itself to the Quinn name. I felt like a ghost in that house, a quiet observer of my own family. I loved them, I suppose, in the way a plant loves the pot that contains it. They were my providers, my reality, but I was not known there. My true self, the part of me that lived in books and daydreams, was a foreigner in my own home. My sanctuary was a brick building 2 miles away, Havenwood High, and more specifically, room 21B. Mr. Anderson's classroom. His room was an island of beautiful, intellectual chaos in an ocean of institutional order. While other classrooms were sterile boxes with desks in neat rows, his was a den. Books overflowed from shelves, stacked on his desk, piled in corners. Posters of Frost and Dickinson, their faces intense and knowing, looked down from the walls. The air itself felt different, charged with a current of excitement. Here, ideas were not just facts to be memorized. They were living things to be wrestled with, debated, and loved. And at the center of it all was Mr. David Anderson. With the painful clarity of hindsight, I can dissect him now, piece by piece, like a specimen under glass. I can see the subtle calculation in his smile, the predatory patience in his gaze. But to my 16-year-old self, he was a god. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way my brother was. His power was in his presence. He moved with a restless energy, pacing before the blackboard, his voice a rich, mesmerizing baritone that could make the oldest poetry feel like a dangerous, whispered secret. He didn't just teach The Great Gatsby. He made you feel the yearning of that green light across the water, the hollowness of the party, the ache of a dream just out of reach. He saw things, and he made us see them too. Most importantly, he made me feel seen. It started subtly. a lingering glance after I'd answered a particularly difficult question about a line in a Keats poem. A small approving note scrawled in red ink at the bottom of an essay. "A truly mature insight, Lily," he wrote once. "You have an old soul." I held on to those words as if they were a holy scripture. An old soul. At home, I was a child who was meant to be quiet and get good grades. In his classroom, I was a peer, a mind worthy of engagement. The day it truly began, he had asked us to write about the symbolism of the scarlet letter. I poured my heart into it, writing not just about sin and punishment, but about the loneliness of being set apart, of being forced to wear a label that eclipsed your entire identity. The next day, he stood before the class, my essay held in his hand. "I want to read you something," he announced, his voice silencing the room. "This is what real analysis looks like. This is taking a text and making it your own." He began to read my words aloud. My words, echoing through that silent, sun-drenched room. I felt a blush creep up my neck, a mixture of terror and overwhelming pride. I stared down at my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. The other students shifted in their seats. I could feel their eyes on me. I was being set apart, anointed. After the bell rang, as I was gathering my books, he called my name. "Lily, a moment." I approached his desk, my knees feeling weak. "That was exceptional work," he said, his eyes intense. He wasn't looking at me like a teacher addressing a student. It felt different, deeper. "You have a gift, a way of seeing past the surface of things. It's rare." "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," I mumbled, my face still hot. "It would be a shame to let a mind like yours be confined by the standard curriculum," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping. "You're capable of so much more." "I've been thinking. I'd be willing to offer you some advanced, private tutoring after school. We could read things the rest of the class isn't ready for. Plath. Camus. We could really push the boundaries of your potential." The offer hung in the air, shimmering with promise. It was everything I secretly craved. To be chosen, to be seen as special, to be worthy of more. It was a lifeline thrown to the quiet girl who felt invisible in her own home. It was a validation that I could finally present to my father, an achievement that even he might be forced to respect. I rushed home that afternoon, my feet barely touching the pavement. I burst through the front door, for once not caring about the noise I was making. My mother was in the living room, arranging roses in a crystal vase. "Mother," I exclaimed, my voice breathless with excitement. "Mr. Anderson, the English teacher, he thinks I'm gifted. He wants to give me private tutoring sessions after school to study advanced literature." She turned, a single, perfectly shaped rose in her hand. Her initial expression was one of annoyance at my sudden, loud entrance, but then the words registered. "Mr. Anderson. The David Anderson. The man whose opinion mattered in Havenwood. The man who sat on the board of the local library and was a regular guest at the mayor's dinner parties." A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine smile of social triumph. "Well, Lily," she said, her voice filled with a warmth I rarely heard directed at me. "Isn't that wonderful?" My father's reaction that evening was even more potent. When my mother relayed the news at the dinner table, he actually put down his fork and looked at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. It wasn't warmth, not exactly. It was appraisal, as if one of his stocks had suddenly, unexpectedly, shot up in value. "David Anderson," he said, nodding slowly. "A good man to have in your corner, a man of significant standing." He looked at me, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "Excellent, Lily. This reflects well on the family. Reflects well on the family." I felt a surge of elation. Those were the magic words. I had finally done it. I had brought honor to the house of Quinn in a currency my father understood. I see it so clearly now, from the lonely vista of my 80th year. I see them all, arranged in that fatal tableau. My father, blinded by ambition. My mother, blinded by fear. And me, blinded by a desperate need to be seen. None of us saw the man standing in the shadows just beyond the footlights. We only saw the golden boy on his pedestal, a pedestal they were more than happy to help him build. They didn't see a predator choosing his prey. They saw a prize being awarded to their family. They smiled and polished his pedestal, and in their eagerness for reflected glory, they handed me over without a second thought. The first lock on the door of my cage had just been turned, and my own parents were the ones holding the key. My father's words, "This reflects well on the family," were a benediction. They were the permission I had craved, the stamp of approval that transformed my private hopes into a public, sanctioned reality. I felt a lightness in my step the next day as I walked to school, the crisp autumn air feeling charged with promise. The familiar red and gold leaves skittering across the sidewalk seemed like confetti thrown in celebration of my new status. I was no longer just Lily Quinn, the quiet girl with good grades. I was Lily Quinn, the prodigy, the one chosen by Mr. Anderson. I walked toward his classroom for that first private session, like a celebrant approaching an altar, my heart filled with a reverent thrill. I never once considered that I was not the worshiper, but the intended sacrifice. The school was a different creature after the 3 o'clock bell. The boisterous, chaotic energy bled out of the hallways, leaving behind a deep, humming silence. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder, the scent of floor wax was sharper. Mr. Anderson's classroom, usually a hive of activity, was still and expectant. The afternoon sun, now low in the sky, slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in its golden shafts and casting long, distorted shadows that stretched from the legs of the empty desks. The space felt more intimate, more significant. This was not a public classroom anymore. It was a private world, created just for the two of us. He was waiting, sitting not behind his imposing oak desk, but perched on the edge of it, as if to diminish the distance between us. He smiled as I entered, a warm, conspiratorial smile that made me feel like a collaborator, not a student. "Lily, I'm so glad you came," he said, his voice softer than it was in class. "I've been looking forward to this." He gestured to the chair beside his desk, the one usually reserved for visiting parents. I sat, placing my books neatly beside me. The familiar landscape of the room now felt entirely new, seen from this privileged vantage point. "I thought we'd start with something unorthodox," he said, his eyes gleaming. He reached behind him and produced a book with a stark, unsettling cover, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I had heard of it, of course, whispered about as something dark and dangerous, something girls like me were not supposed to read. "The school board would have a collective aneurysm if they knew I was giving you this," he said with a low chuckle. "They think high school students should be fed a steady diet of sanitized classics, but you're not like them, are you, Lily? You're not afraid of the dark." He was bestowing a secret upon me, a small act of rebellion. We were allies against the small-mindedness of the world. He wasn't just giving me a book, he was giving me a boundary to cross with him, a shared transgression that bound us together. As I reached for the novel, my fingers trembling slightly with anticipation, his hand covered mine, pressing the book into my palm. His skin was warm, his touch firm. It lasted only a second longer than necessary, a beat of silence that was both insignificant and monumental. A jolt, electric and confusing, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back, my heart doing a nervous flutter kick against my ribs. It was an accident, I told myself. A simple, friendly gesture, but even as I rationalized it, a tiny, cold warning bell chimed in a distant part of my mind, a bell I was already learning to ignore. That first session set the template for the weeks that followed. Our meetings, twice a week, became the twin poles around which my world revolved. He was a masterful teacher, and he delivered on his promise. We tore through Plath, then Camus, then Sartre. He unlocked worlds for me, gave me the language for the formless anxieties and apathies that sometimes swam in my own teenage heart. I felt my mind expanding, growing brighter, sharper. I was dazzling him with my insights, and he was dazzling me with his attention. But looking back, I see the other curriculum, the unspoken one, that was his true focus. During our second week, he began to share his own confidences. He would lean back in his chair, run a hand through his thick, dark hair, and sigh. "You know, Lily," he said one afternoon, staring out the window at the dying light, "it's a lonely thing to feel like you're the only one in a town who's truly awake." He spoke of his wife, A fictional wife, I would later realize, as he had never been married. A woman named Catherine, who was a good person, but she doesn't understand this. He gestured vaguely at the books, at the air around us. She doesn't understand the life of the mind. She's content with her garden club and her bridge games. He had painted himself as a tragic hero, trapped in a mundane world, just as I felt trapped. He was inviting me into the sacred circle of his loneliness, making me his sole confidant. My teenage heart swelled with a feeling of profound importance. I was the one who understood him. I was his intellectual equal, his spiritual compatriot. Each fabricated secret he shared was another brick in the wall he was building around me, a wall designed to keep the rest of the world out. The praise became more specific, more isolating. I was at a faculty meeting yesterday, he told me, his tone laced with weary disappointment. Listening to the other teachers talk about literature, it was like listening to children talk about astrophysics. They don't get it, not the way you do. He made me feel set apart not just from my peers, but from all the other authority figures in my life. He was the one true source of knowledge, of understanding. My world began to shrink until his classroom was its sole illuminated center. The touches, once fleeting and deniable, became more frequent. A hand on my shoulder as he leaned over my chair to point out a passage, his fingers pressing gently into my collarbone, his knee brushing against mine as he sat on the desk beside me. Once, when I'd made a particularly sharp observation about a line of poetry, he'd reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers grazing my cheek. "Brilliant," he whispered, his face close to mine. Each gesture was a tiny, calculated trespass, small enough that to protest would make me seem foolish, hysterical, or worse, ungrateful. He was an expert in plausible deniability. He operated in the gray spaces, in the ambiguities of gesture and tone, always making me question my own instincts. Am I imagining this? Am I making too much of it? He was teaching me to distrust myself, a lesson that would serve him well. The lock on the door was being fortified from the outside, too. At home, my new status as Mr. Anderson's protégé had subtly shifted the family dynamic. My father spoke to me with a new respect. My mother preened whenever her friends mentioned my special lessons. They were a tangible social victory. One evening, I came home from a session feeling particularly unsettled. He had spent much of the hour talking about the tragedy of unrealized passion, his eyes holding mine with a heavy, searching intensity that made my skin crawl. The intellectual thrill was gone, replaced by a low, humming dread. I found my mother in the kitchen, humming as she polished the silver. "Mr. Anderson is very intense," I ventured, testing the waters, unsure of what I was even trying to say. She didn't look up from the fork she was rubbing. A proud smile touched her lips. "Of course he is, dear. He's a brilliant man, passionate. It's what makes him such a wonderful teacher." "You're so incredibly lucky." Eleanor Henderson was just saying at the bridge club how impressed everyone is that he's taken such an interest in you. Her words were a silken wall. She heard intense and translated it to brilliant. She heard my nascent concern and turned it into a story of social triumph. My unease was an inconvenient truth that simply did not fit the beautiful narrative she was constructing. To her, I wasn't a child in a potentially dangerous situation. I was a prized possession, a reflection of her own good taste and her daughter's high value. There was no room for my feelings in her story. That night, my father stopped me in the hallway. "Keep up the good work with Anderson, Lily," he said, placing a heavy, proprietary hand on my shoulder. "The Andersons are an old Havenwood family. Good people. This connection is valuable." Valuable. The word was so cold, so transactional. He wasn't seeing a mentorship. He was seeing a strategic asset, an entry in a social ledger. My excitement, my learning, my burgeoning, formless fear, it was all irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the value of the connection, the way it reflected on the family name. The turning point came on a late Thursday afternoon in November. A cold rain had begun to fall, lashing against the tall classroom windows and encasing us in a gray, watery bubble. The world outside disappeared. It was just the two of us, the sound of the rain and the low hum of the lights. We were reading poetry, but he seemed distracted. He put his book down and looked at me, his face a mask of sorrow. My wife, Catherine. She asked me why I spend so much time here with you, he said, his voice thick with a carefully crafted pain. I tried to explain it to her. That this is where I feel alive. This is the only real thing in my life. He reached across the small space between us and took my hand. His was warm and dry around my cold, damp one. I froze. This was different. This wasn't a fleeting, accidental touch. He held my hand firmly, turning it over, tracing the lines on my palm with his thumb. She'll never understand, he whispered, his eyes boring into mine. A soul like yours. A soul like mine. We are destined to be lonely. Unless we find each other. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. The alarm bells in my head were no longer chiming. They were screaming, a deafening, frantic clangor. This was wrong. This was a line being crossed, a chasm opening at my feet. I should pull my hand away. I should stand up. I should run. But I was paralyzed by the books we'd read, the secrets he'd shared, the praise he'd showered upon me, paralyzed by the specter of my mother's proud, dismissive smile and my father's talk of value. To protest now would be to unravel everything, to declare myself a fool, to shatter the beautiful image my parents held so dear. It would be an act of supreme ingratitude, and so I sat there, a statue with a wildly beating heart, my hand held captive in his. That was the moment. The moment the air in the room changed from intellectual excitement to something suffocating and predatory. The sanctuary had become the trap. The door was not just locked, it was bolted shut. And I could hear the faint, distant sound of my parents on the other side, smiling and polishing the brass, applauding the man who was so expertly, so patiently, turning the key. The rain had stopped. That's the first thing I remember. In the sudden, profound silence that followed his last whispered words, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip of water from the eaves outside the window. One drop, then another, each one landing with the finality of a closing parenthesis. My hand was still in his, but it was no longer my hand. It was a distant object, a piece of stone he had picked up from a riverbed. I was floating somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at the girl in the chair, the one with my face and my clothes, and I felt a cool, detached pity for her. She looked so small. His other hand, the one that had held a pen just moments before, came up to cup my jaw. It was a gesture I had seen in old black and white movies, a gesture meant to convey tenderness, adoration. But his touch was not tender. It was possessive, a claim. The voice that had explained the tragic beauty of Gatsby's dream now murmured things that shattered the world, dismantling it piece by piece until all that was left was the suffocating space between us. His hands, which had once pointed out the genius of a line of poetry, were now teaching a different, brutal lesson, a lesson in pressure, in submission, in the geography of my own fear. I felt the rough texture of the wool of his jacket against my cheek, smelled the faint, academic scent of old paper and coffee on his breath. I closed my eyes, and the girl floating near the ceiling drifted further away, leaving the body behind to learn its lesson in silence. When it was over, the world rushed back in with a nauseating roar. The dripping from the eaves, the hum of the lights, the solid feel of the wooden chair beneath me. I was back inside myself, and the self I returned to was a shattered, violated thing. I expected him to move away, to look ashamed, to say something, anything, to acknowledge the chasm that had just opened between us. He did not. He simply smoothed my hair back from my forehead, his touch now unnervingly gentle, as if soothing a frightened animal. He looked into my eyes, his own filled not with lust or guilt, but with a serene, terrifying conviction. "This," he said, his voice a soft, hypnotic hum, "is our secret now, a testament to how special our bond is. You feel it, don't you, Lily? The connection between us. It's inevitable." I could only stare, my mind a white noise hiss of static. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "This is what happens between two souls who truly understand each other. It's beautiful. But the world, the small-minded people in this town, they would never understand. They would twist it, pervert it, make it ugly. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall of my new prison. Think of your father, Lily. A man of his standing. Think of your dear, fragile mother. The shame this would bring upon them. It would destroy them. The whispers, the gossip. It would ruin everything he's worked for. Everything they believe in. He paused, letting the horror of his words sink in. He had found the master switch. He knew, with an animal's instinct for weakness, that my own pain would always be secondary to my fear of causing theirs. And you, he continued, his thumb gently stroking my cheek. They would say terrible things about you. They wouldn't call you a brilliant young woman. They would call you a liar. They would say you wanted it, or worse. He let that word hang in the air, its ugly shape filling the room. He had just handed me a shield and a sword. The shield was my family's honor. The sword was the threat of my own ruin, and he had made it clear that my only choice was to use them to defend him. He stood up then, all business, as if the last 10 minutes had been nothing more than a punctuation mark in our lesson. You should get home before it gets dark, he said, his voice back to its normal, professorial tone. Read the first 50 pages of Camus for Tuesday. I want to hear your thoughts on the absurdity of existence. The absurdity of existence. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. I moved like an automaton, my limbs stiff and uncooperative. I gathered my books, my fingers fumbling with the slick covers. I did not look at him. I could feel his eyes on me, calm and patient. As I reached the door, he said my name. Lily. I stopped but did not turn. This changes nothing between us, he said. Except that now, we have a truth that no one else in the world shares. Cherish it. The walk home was a journey through a nightmare. The familiar world had been distorted, as if seen through a warped and filthy lens. The friendly, clapboard houses with their welcoming porch lights seemed to leer at me. The gnarled branches of the oak trees lining the street looked like skeletal fingers reaching for me. I felt marked, tainted, as if the rain had washed away my invisibility and left a stain on my skin that everyone could see. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping over me, and I flinched, convinced the driver could see the secret I was carrying. My mind was a maelstrom of shame and confusion. Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I fight? I just sat there. I let him. Did I want this? Did I lead him on? The questions were a merciless chorus, a litany of self-blame. He had spent months teaching me to crave his approval, to see his attention as the ultimate prize. The line between that approval and this act, had been so expertly, so methodically blurred, I could no longer see where one ended and the other began. He had designed the trap so that my own instincts now felt like the enemy, my own body a traitor that had failed to protect me. Opening the front door to my house was the hardest part. The pristine order, the scent of lemon polish, the quiet, gleaming perfection of it all. It was a violent reproach to the chaotic filth I felt inside me. My mother was in the dining room, setting the table for dinner. She smiled at me. "You're late, dear," she said, her voice a gentle, unconcerned melody. "Wash up for dinner." I nodded, unable to speak, and fled up the stairs. In the bathroom mirror, a stranger looked back at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have no bottom. I turned on the faucet and scrubbed my hands, my face, scrubbing until my skin was raw, but I couldn't wash away the feeling of his touch, the memory of his voice. The tutoring sessions continued. The thought of not going was unbearable, but the thought of the alternative was worse. What would he do? What would he say? What questions would my parents ask? My father's lecture about the valuable connection echoed in my head. To stop going would be an act of sabotage against my own family, and so twice a week I walked back to that room. The abuse became the new routine. He was a master of normalization. He would begin each session by discussing literature, his tone as calm and academic as ever. We would talk about tragic flaws and existential dread for 20 minutes. And then, As if it were the most natural thing in the world, he would lock the classroom door and the other lesson would begin. He taught me about iambic pentameter while simultaneously teaching me to endure the unbearable. He taught me about the nature of sin in Hawthorne while meticulously crafting my own sense of complicity and shame. He was breaking my mind and calling it education. The decay was swift. I stopped eating. Food tasted like ash in my mouth. Sleep offered no escape, only a landscape of suffocating, formless nightmares from which I would wake with a silent scream lodged in my throat. I became a ghost. My grades in every other class began to plummet. I couldn't concentrate. The words on the pages of my history and science textbooks were just meaningless black marks. The only reality was the dread of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. My parents noticed, of course, but they saw only the surface of things. "Lily, you look pale. You're getting too thin," my mother would say, a frown of aesthetic displeasure on her face. "Is Mr. Anderson working you too hard? You must be sure to get your rest." The question was not born of concern for my well-being, but of pride in my scholarly martyrdom. My father saw my other grades. "A C in biology, Lily?" he said one evening, his voice sharp with disappointment. "What's the meaning of this?" Don't think that just because you're excelling with Anderson, you can let everything else slide. A Quinn is excellent in all things. They were looking right at me, at the drowning girl, and all they could see were the ripples I was making on the surface of their perfect pond. One night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out my window at the neat, orderly street below. A string of perfect houses, each with a warm light glowing in the window, each holding a family I imagined was happy, normal. I felt a loneliness so vast and absolute, it was like a physical presence in the room. Every door was locked. My teacher was my abuser. My parents were his guards, and my own mind, the one thing I had always treasured as my own, was now a prison of his design, its walls built with his words, its locks forged from my shame. That was his greatest lesson, the one that would take me half a century to unlearn. He had taught me that my silence was a virtue, a noble sacrifice. He convinced me it was a shield to protect my family, a testament to my strength and my loyalty. He had dressed my terror up in the costume of honor, but it wasn't a shield. It was a shroud. And he had wrapped it around me so tightly, I had forgotten how to breathe. The shroud of silence he had wrapped around me was suffocating, but it was also strangely heavy. It was a burden I carried every moment of every day. To the outside world, I was merely a quiet, serious girl. Inside, I was a battlefield of unspoken terror. The nights were the worst. Sleep was a treacherous country I was forced to visit, and the monsters there were relentless. I would wake in the dark, my own hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a scream, the phantom feeling of his touch still on my skin. During the day, I learned to dissociate, to send my mind away to a quiet, gray room where nothing could reach it. But sometimes, something would pierce through the fog. It happened one crisp Saturday morning in town. I had been sent to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription for my father. As I was leaving, I saw a mother and her young daughter, who couldn't have been more than 5, sitting on the bench by the town square. The little girl had tripped and scraped her knee, and she was crying those huge, gulping sobs of childhood injustice. Her mother, without a word, simply gathered the child into her arms, stroking her hair, murmuring soft, comforting nonsense. She wiped the tears away, kissed the scraped knee, and held her daughter until the sobs subsided into hiccups. It was a small, simple act of unconditional tenderness, a moment so ordinary and yet so powerful, it struck me like a physical blow. A fierce, desperate longing rose up in me, so potent it made me dizzy. The girl in my mind, the one floating near the ceiling, came rushing back into my body with a painful jolt. I wanted that. I wanted a mother who would see my pain, no matter how small, and make it her own. I wanted a sanctuary. And in that moment, a new, desperate, and profoundly foolish hope was born. I convinced myself that the woman I'd just seen on the bench existed somewhere inside my own mother. I believed that beneath the polished, anxious surface of Helen Quinn, there was a real mother, and that if I could only find the right words, if I could only present my pain to her in a way she could understand, she would gather me in her arms and save me. It was the last, flickering ember of a child's faith, a faith I was about to offer up to the wind. The decision to speak was a physical torment. For days, I orbited my mother like a nervous planet, searching for the right moment, the right alignment of domestic stars that might signal an opening. I watched her as she moved through her kingdom of appearances. I watched her prune the prize-winning roses in her garden, her hands protected by pristine white gloves, snipping away any dead or dying bloom with ruthless precision. I watched her plan a dinner party for my father's business associates, her brow furrowed in concentration over seating charts and menus, the social calculus of it all as complex as any military campaign. Everything she did was about maintaining the perfect surface, about cutting away imperfection. The more I watched her, the more my foolish hope withered, but my desperation grew. I had to try. It was the only door I hadn't yet found bolted. I chose a Saturday afternoon when my father and Mark were at a football game. The house was quiet, filled with the lazy golden light of autumn. I found her in the sunroom, her favorite spot, a space she called her sanctuary. It was a room of feminine perfection, white wicker furniture with floral cushions, ferns dripping from hanging baskets, the air smelling faintly of potting soil and lemon verbena. She sat in her armchair, her needlepoint hoop in her lap, her hands moving with a quick, practiced grace. She was embroidering a pillowcase with a delicate vine of ivy, a perfect, controlled representation of nature. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My palms were slick with sweat. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, a silent supplicant at the entrance to a hollow shrine. "Mother?" My voice was a thin, reedy thing. She looked up, her expression one of mild surprise, not annoyance. It was a good start. "Yes, Lily." "What is it, dear?" I walked into the room, my feet sinking into the plush white carpet. I perched on the edge of the matching ottoman, a safe distance away. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "All right," she said, her eyes already drifting back down to her needlework. She separated a strand of green thread from its skein. I took a deep breath. "It's about the lessons." "With Mr. Anderson." "Oh?" Her needle dipped into the fabric. "I hope you're remembering to thank him properly." "It's an incredible opportunity. Yes, I do," I said quickly. "It's just, they're very intense." I chose the word carefully, the same one I had used before, hoping this time it might land on more fertile ground. "Well, of course they are," she said with a little laugh, as if I'd stated the obvious. "He's a very brilliant man. Nothing worthwhile is easy, Lily." She was reciting a line, a platitude from the parental handbook. She wasn't listening. "Sometimes," I pushed on, my voice trembling slightly, "he says things, personal things, about his life. About passion and things like that. It makes me feel uncomfortable." I was pleading with her, begging her to hear the word, beneath the word, comfortable. A word a girl uses when she is too terrified to use the word afraid. Her needle paused mid-stitch. She didn't look up, but I saw her knuckles tighten around the embroidery hoop. "Uncomfortable?" she repeated, the word tasting like something foreign and unpleasant in her mouth. "Lily, don't be so dramatic. He probably sees a kindred spirit in you. A man of his intellect. It must be lonely for him. You should feel honored that he feels he can confide in you." The air was growing colder. The sunlight in the room seemed to thin, losing its warmth. My last ember of hope was beginning to smoke. I had to give it one last breath of air. "It's more than that," I whispered, the words tearing at my throat. My eyes filled with tears, blurring the image of her into a soft, floral shape. "The way he looks at me sometimes. The way he touches my arm." My hair. I couldn't say more. I couldn't give shape to the monstrous reality of it. But I had laid the pieces at her feet, praying she would have the courage to assemble them. She put the embroidery hoop down on the table beside her. She did it very slowly, very deliberately. When she looked up at me, her face was a pale, tight mask. The soft, maternal concern I had been hallucinating was gone, replaced by something cold and reptilian. It was panic, but it was not panic for me. "Stop it!" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Stop this right now!" I flinched as if she had struck me. "You have a vivid imagination, Lily." "You always have," she continued, her voice gaining a sharp, cruel edge. You read these dark, dramatic books and you think life is supposed to be a tragedy. Are you trying to cause trouble? Is that it? Are you jealous of your brother's success, and now you need to be the center of attention? The accusations were so wildly off the mark, so completely disconnected from the terrified plea I was making, that I couldn't even process them. No, I managed to choke out. No, What did you do? She snapped, leaning forward, her eyes narrowed. A respected man like David Anderson, a family man, doesn't just misbehave. What did you do to encourage him? The way you are, so quiet and intense all the time, you must have given him the wrong impression. You must have. The blame, so swift and absolute, sucked the air from my lungs. And then came the real fear, the true monster she was trying to keep at bay. Her eyes widened with a terror that was entirely for herself, for my father, for the fragile house of cards she lived in. "Do you have any idea," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage, "any idea at all what a scandal like this would do to your father? To this family? To our name in this town? Everything your father has worked for, everything we have built would be ruined." "Is that what you want, Lily? To destroy your own family with these wicked, pathetic lies?" I was speechless, paralyzed by the sheer violence of her betrayal. This wasn't a slammed door. This was a demolition. She stood up then, pulling herself to her full height. She was no longer a mother. She was a judge, a warden, a terrifying force of pure, self-preserving will. "You will not speak of this again," she commanded, her voice like ice. "Not to me. Not to your father, not to anyone. It is a dangerous fantasy, and it ends right now. You will go to your lessons with Mr. Anderson. You will be polite, you will be respectful, and you will be grateful for the opportunity he is giving you. Do you understand me?" I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a tiny, spastic movement of my head. The tears had frozen in my eyes. The last ember of hope had not just been extinguished, it had been ground into dust under her heel. "Good," she said. Satisfied, she turned away from me. With a trembling hand, she picked up a small brass watering can and began to water her ferns, her movements jerky and agitated. Her focus was already on restoring the surface, erasing the ugly crack I had just made in her perfect world, tending to her plants while her own child bled out on the floor behind her. It was not his hands that finally broke me. It was hers. His was the predictable violence of a predator. Hers was the intimate, soul-destroying violence of an architect destroying the last exit in a burning building. He had trapped my body, but in that sunlit floral room, my mother trapped my soul. The sanctuary was not just empty, it was a tomb, and she had just rolled the stone over the entrance, sealing me inside with the monster. The water in the sunroom had long since been absorbed by the ferns, but I was still drowning. The conversation with my mother had not been a confrontation, it had been an ending. Hope is a loud, demanding emotion. When it dies, the silence it leaves is absolute and profound. In the echoing quiet of that silence, standing in the hallway outside the room where my mother had just sentenced me to a lifetime of solitary confinement, I made a new vow. It was not a vow to fight or to escape or to survive. It was a vow to disappear. If the price of my existence was to be an invisible, silent ghost, then I would become the most perfect ghost they had ever seen. The art of vanishing is a subtle one. It begins with the eyes. At school, I learned to walk with my gaze fixed on the point where the lockers met the linoleum floor. I mastered the ability to move through a crowded hallway like a whisper, my shoulders turned slightly inward, making myself smaller, less of an obstacle. I was a ship learning to sail in the fog, hugging the coastline of the walls, my presence so muted that I could pass friends I'd known since kindergarten without them even registering I was there. In my classes, the ones not taught by him, I became a model of passive obedience. I never raised my hand. I spoke only when directly addressed, and my answers were short, correct, and utterly devoid of personality. I gave them nothing to notice, nothing to latch on to. My sessions with Anderson changed as well. The thin, rotten veneer of intellectual mentorship was stripped away entirely. He no longer needed it. My desperate, failed plea to my mother had been the greatest gift I could have given him. It was confirmation of his absolute power, proof that my cage was locked from both the inside and the outside. The abuse became more routine, less cloaked in the language of a special bond. It was colder now, a simple, brutal exertion of his will. He knew I had nowhere to go. He was no longer just my abuser, he was my keeper, and his victory was so complete that he no longer even felt the need to celebrate it. It was simply a fact, a law of the universe we inhabited together in that silent afternoon room. At home, my ghostly transformation was perfected. Dinner became a masterclass in non-existence. I would sit at the table, a phantom at the feast, moving food around my plate, my ears filled with the loud, vibrant sounds of my brother's life. I would offer a quiet yes or no when required, my voice a colorless thread in the rich tapestry of their conversation. As soon as the meal was over, I would murmur, "May I be excused," and retreat to the sterile quiet of my bedroom. My room was my cell, my tomb, my only safe territory. I would lie on my bed for hours, not reading, not listening to music, just staring at the ceiling, letting the gray twilight of my new existence wash over me. I was perfecting the art of being physically present but spiritually absent. I was the empty chair at my own family's table. My brother, Mark, was the sun. And like the sun, he was blissfully unaware of the shadows he cast. His life was a symphony of triumphs, played at full volume, and my parents were his rapt audience. The contrast between us was not just a quiet fact. It was the central organizing principle of our family. I remember one night in October, I had received a D on a calculus test. My mind, once so sharp, could no longer follow the clean logic of numbers. It was a foggy, treacherous landscape now, filled with trapdoors and hidden monsters. My father held the test paper in his hand at the dinner table as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. "A D, Lily?" he said, his voice low and heavy with a disappointment that felt like acid. "This is unacceptable. I don't pay for a private education for you to bring home grades like this. What is wrong with you?" I stared at my plate, my silence his only answer. My mother looked at me, her face a mask of anxious irritation. She wasn't worried about my struggle. She was worried that the neighbors might find out, that the facade of the perfect Quinn children was cracking. In the thick, suffocating silence of my failure, Mark cleared his throat. "Hey, Dad," he said, a casual grin on his face. "Guess who they named team captain today?" The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and violent. My father's thunderous expression vanished, replaced by a booming, incandescent pride. "Captain! Well, I'll be damned! Mark, that's incredible!" He reached across the table and clapped my brother on the shoulder. My mother's face lit up, her anxiety dissolving into pure, radiant joy. "Oh, Mark, honey, that's wonderful! Captain!" "We have to call your grandmother." The rest of the meal was a loud, happy celebration of Mark. They talked about the upcoming season, the importance of leadership, the honor he was bringing to the Quinn name. I sat in the blinding glare of their adoration, an unnoticed gray smudge on their masterpiece. The shadow I cast was not just my own misery. It was a necessary darkness required to make my brother's light seem that much brighter. The weekends were a stark diptych of our two lives. My Saturdays were long, silent corridors of time, spent in the quiet of my room. The house, for me, was a place of waiting, of bracing for the next inevitable horror. Mark's Saturdays filled the house with life. The phone would ring, always for him. The sounds of his friends laughing and shouting as they threw a football in the backyard would drift up through my window. Later, the house would buzz with the purposeful energy of my parents getting ready to attend his game. The scent of my mother's perfume, the sound of my father jingling his keys, the excited chatter. It was the soundtrack of a life I was not a part of. "Are you coming to the game, Lily?" my mother might ask, her hand already on the doorknob, her question a perfunctory nod to a duty she was glad to be free of. "I have to study," I would lie, and she would accept it with a relieved smile. The golden autumn of my hope decayed into a long, bleak winter. The trees outside my window became stark, skeletal silhouettes against a perpetually gray sky. The world outside mirrored the world within. The abuse continued, a grinding, monotonous rhythm, a bleak winter that had no promise of a spring. The first violation is a lightning strike, a catastrophic event that splits your world in two. The 100th is just the weather. You learn to live with the storm. You learn to walk with your head down, to expect the cold rain, to find a strange, numb comfort in the predictability of your own misery. The final, public confirmation of my new status came at the Winter Sports Academic Awards ceremony at the school. My attendance was mandatory, for appearances. I sat alone in the auditorium, a few rows behind my parents. They were beaming, their faces turned toward the stage, their posture radiating pride. Mark was up there, a Letterman jacket draped over his chair, set to receive the Athlete of the Year award. When his name was called, the applause was thunderous. My parents leaped to their feet, my father letting out a whistle, my mother clapping so hard her face was flushed with joy. I watched them, two strangers celebrating their triumphant son. I felt nothing. No jealousy, no anger, just a quiet, clinical understanding. During a lull, one of my former teachers, Miss Gable, passed them in the aisle. "Richard Helen," she said with a warm smile. "Congratulations on Mark. He's a wonderful boy." Then her expression shifted to one of concern. "I've been a bit worried about Lily this year," she said quietly. "She seems so distant." "Is everything all right?" I watched my mother's smile tighten into a polite, brittle mask. "Oh, you know teenagers," she said with a light, dismissive laugh. "So dramatic." "She's just been focusing so hard on her advanced studies with Mr. Anderson. He really works her." "Now, did you see the photo of Mark in the paper last week?" She had changed the subject with the swift, practiced skill of a diplomat averting an international incident. I didn't stay to see Mark get his trophy. I slipped out a side door into the cold, sharp night. Walking home under the indifferent stars, I finally understood my function. In my father's eyes, Mark was a thriving asset, and I had become a non-performing liability. To my mother, he was a crown she wore with pride, while I was a stain on the fabric of her life, a stain she was constantly, anxiously trying to hide from view. They didn't see two children. They saw a ledger, a balance sheet of honor and shame. And to make their books balance, his light required my darkness. I was the growing shadow that made his triumphs possible, the silent, unhappy daughter who made their happy, successful son seem all the more miraculous. It was my role in the family play, and for a long, gray, endless winter, I performed it perfectly. The winter of my disappearance eventually, grudgingly, gave way to spring. The world outside my window began a slow, tentative resurrection. Pale green buds appeared on the skeletal branches of the trees. The perpetually gray sky occasionally fractured to reveal a sliver of brilliant, painful blue, and the cold, hard ground softened. The town of Havenwood was awakening, stretching after a long sleep. But as the world came back to life, my own body began a strange and terrifying rebellion. I had succeeded in turning my mind into a fortress of gray stone, a place of silence and shadows. But I had forgotten about the body. The body is a stubborn and honest creature. It keeps a separate ledger, an accounting of truths that the mind tries to deny. And while my soul had perfected the art of silence, my body was preparing to scream. It began as a subtle malaise, a wave of nausea in the morning that I would swallow down, blaming it on a sleepless night. A profound, bone-deep fatigue that settled into my limbs, a weariness that went far beyond the emotional exhaustion I'd grown accustomed to. I would sit in class, my head feeling heavy as a cannonball, the teacher's voice a distant, meaningless drone. Food, which I had long since lost interest in, now became actively repulsive. The smell of my mother cooking bacon in the morning, once a comforting aroma, now sent me fleeing to my room, my stomach churning. For weeks I dismissed it all. It was stress. It was the lingering shadow of the long winter. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. The moment of truth did not arrive in a dramatic flash, but in a quiet, mundane click of understanding. I was in my room, supposed to be studying for a history final, but my gaze was fixed on the small promotional calendar from the local bank that was tacked to my corkboard. It featured a different picturesque Havenwood scene for each month. I idly traced the progression of the seasons with my finger, the stark black and white of January, the tentative green of April, the full bloom of May. My finger stopped on the current month, and then, a cold, sickening lurch in the pit of my stomach. My mind, for so long a foggy, unreliable place, suddenly became a machine of brutal, efficient calculation. I counted backwards. 1 week. 4. 8. I closed my eyes, a silent litany of afternoon sessions in a sunlit, dusty room playing behind my lids. The math was simple, it was horrifying, and it was undeniable. The denial came first, a fierce, primal rejection of the facts. No, it's not possible. It can't be, it was a fluke, a mistake. My body was just confused, thrown off by months of stress and misery. I clung to these rationalizations like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. But beneath the denial, a deeper, colder current of terror was pulling me under. The memories I had worked so hard to suppress, to lock away in the gray fortress of my mind, came roaring back. But they were different now. They were not just memories of a psychological violation. They were memories of a biological act, an act with consequences, an act that had left a permanent, growing mark. The next few days were a blur of managed panic. I moved through my life with a secret that felt like a physical weight in my gut, a hot, ticking bomb that only I could hear. The final, formal confirmation became an obsession. I needed to see it in black and white, to hold the terrible proof in my hand. The ordeal of acquiring a pregnancy test was a special kind of hell designed for a 16-year-old girl in a town like Havenwood. The town pharmacy was out of the question. The pharmacist, Mr. Gable, was the husband of the teacher who had expressed concern for me. The thought of facing him, of him guessing my secret, was paralyzing. I had to wait until the following Saturday. I told my parents I was going to the library, and instead, I took a bus to a neighboring town, a dingy industrial place where no one knew my name. I walked into a cavernous, anonymous drugstore, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt as though the words "shameful secret" were tattooed on my forehead. I found the tests tucked away in a dusty corner, and I grabbed a box with a trembling hand, keeping my head down. I paid the cashier, a bored-looking older woman who didn't even glance at me, with a handful of crumpled, sweaty bills I'd saved from my allowance. The bus ride home was a torture of suspense, the small, rectangular box in my bag feeling as heavy as a gravestone. I waited until the house was empty. My parents were at their country club for their weekly golf game. The silence, which had once been my refuge, now felt menacing and expectant. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, a place of mundane, familial privacy that was about to become the scene of my world's end. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely tear open the cardboard box. The plastic stick felt alien and clinical in my hand. I followed the instructions, my mind numb, my body moving on autopilot. Then came the waiting. 3 minutes, the instructions said. It was the longest 3 minutes of my life. I sat on the cold tile of the floor, my arms wrapped around my knees, staring at the small plastic window. I watched as the first line appeared, dark and certain, the control line. For a wild, hysterical moment, I prayed that would be it. But then, slowly, inexorably, like a ghost materializing from the mist, a second line began to form. It was faint at first, a pale pink shadow, but it was there. It was undeniably there. I didn't scream. The sound that came out of me was a low, guttural moan, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. I sank to the floor, the cold of the tiles seeping into my skin. The world didn't shatter. It dissolved. The solid surfaces of my life, the walls of my home, the faces of my family, the future I had once imagined, all melted away into a terrifying, formless void. The ghost I had worked so hard to become was gone. A ghost is an echo of something that is gone. This was the opposite. This was the beginning of something. A new life, born of a crime, the unspeakable truth made flesh. The shadow inside me was no longer a metaphor. It had a heartbeat. Living with the secret was a new dimension of horror. My own body became my enemy, a prison containing the evidence. Every wave of morning sickness was a fresh wave of terror. I would spend my mornings retching silently into the toilet, praying my mother wouldn't hear, my hand clamped over my mouth. I began to feel a strange flutter, a quickening deep inside me, and the sensation, which should have been a miracle, was a grotesque violation. It was his, a part of him, moving inside me. I looked at my family through a thick wall of glass. They were on the other side, living their lives, their voices muffled and distant. They were discussing summer vacation plans, my father's golf handicap, Mark's summer football camp. Their concerns were so trivial, so absurdly normal compared to the catastrophe that was quietly unfolding inside my own skin. My alienation was now absolute. I was not just a stranger in my own home. I was a carrier of a secret that would detonate their world. The sessions with Anderson became almost surreal. I would sit across from him, this man who was a part of my body now, a part of my biology, and I would feel a revulsion so profound it threatened to choke me. I had to hide my nausea from him. I had to hide my fatigue. I had to sit there, discussing the tragic heroines of Thomas Hardy, while his child grew inside me. The irony was a physical sickness. I sometimes wondered if he knew. Did he look at my pale face, my listlessness, and suspect? The fear of him finding out, of him claiming this new, terrible ownership over me, was a constant, low-grade panic. But the secret had a timeline. My body, that honest, stubborn creature, would not keep my secret forever. The day came when I could no longer deny the changes. I stood before the full-length mirror on the back of my bedroom door, something I had avoided for weeks. I pulled my loose sweater tight against my torso. There it was, a small but definite curve to my belly that had not been there before. It was the soft, gentle swell of early pregnancy, and it looked like a monstrous growth. I stared at my reflection, at the pale girl with the haunted eyes and the terrible secret growing in her belly. The despair that had been a formless, drowning sea now solidified into a new, terrible clarity. The ghost couldn't stay a ghost. The silent secret was about to become a visible, undeniable truth. I was out of time. My desperate attempt to tell my mother out of a foolish hope had been a disaster. This time would be different. This time I had to tell them not for comfort, not for salvation, but out of sheer catastrophic necessity. The bomb was about to go off, and it was my duty to inform the inhabitants of the house that it was about to be reduced to rubble. For months I had been a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life. I thought that was the worst it could be, to be a thing of shadows. I was wrong. The body does not deal in metaphors. The shadow inside me was no longer a feeling. It was a fact of flesh and blood. It had its own timeline, its own inexorable rhythm of growth. And I knew, with the certainty of a prisoner watching the water rise in his cell, that my time for being a silent ghost was over. The unspeakable was about to be spoken, and I was the one who would have to say it. The mirror on my bedroom door became my tormentor. Every day, it showed me the undeniable, incremental truth of my changing body. The secret was no longer an abstract terror. It was a physical reality, a slow, inexorable tide rising against the shores of my silence. The ghost had been given flesh, and the flesh had a timeline. There was no more room for shadows or disappearing acts. A choice had to be made, a verdict delivered. I knew, with a certainty that felt like cold iron in my veins, that I would not be the one to deliver it. I was merely the messenger, the one tasked with announcing the imminent detonation. I waited for Sunday evening. In our house, Sunday evening was a time of quiet digestion, both of food and of the weekend. My father would be in his leather armchair in the living room, reading the paper, a glass of scotch on the coaster beside him. My mother would be tidying up, the faint scent of her lavender polish in the air. Mark was out with friends. The house was settled, calm, complacent. It was the perfect time to set it on fire. I came down the stairs, each step a conscious, deliberate act. I walked into the living room, a space of hushed masculine comfort, and stood before my father. "Father," I said. My voice did not shake. It was a flat, dead thing. "Mother, I need to speak with you both, in the study." My father lowered his paper, his brow furrowed in irritation at this breach of his evening peace. My mother, who was adjusting a picture frame on the mantelpiece, froze, her hands still in the air. My formal tone, the gravity of my summons, was an alarm bell they could not ignore. Anxiety bloomed on my mother's face. My father's expression was simply one of annoyance. He sighed, folded his paper with a loud crackle, and rose from his chair. "Very well, Lily," he said, his voice clipped. "Let's get this over with." I led them to the study. It was my father's sanctum, A room that smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and power. Dark wood bookcases lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that I knew for a fact he had never read. They were props, part of the stage set of his life. He took his place behind his vast mahogany desk, assuming the role of judge. My mother did not sit. She hovered near the door, a nervous, fluttering bird, ready to take flight at the first sign of trouble. I stood in the center of the room, on the Persian rug, a defendant in the dock. I let the silence build for a moment, let them feel the weight of it. Then, I delivered the sentence. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice as flat and lifeless as the winter sky. "I'm pregnant." The words dropped into the heavy silence of the room and exploded, not with a bang, but with a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked all the air out. My mother made a sound, a strangled gasp, and her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with horror, darted from me to my father. It was not the horror of a mother fearing for her child. It was the pure, unadulterated terror of a hostess who has just seen a guest spill a bottle of red wine on her priceless white carpet. "No," she whispered, shaking her head frantically. "Oh God, no." "Richard, no, it can't be." My father's reaction was slower and 1,000 times more terrifying. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared at me, his face, which had been merely irritated, slowly transforming. The color drained from it, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of fury. It was not a hot, explosive anger. It was a glacier, silent, massive, and utterly destructive. I watched his knuckles turn white as he gripped the carved arms of his leather throne. My mother's panic was a grass fire, loud and chaotic. My father's anger was the coming of an ice age. When he finally spoke, his voice was preternaturally calm, which made the words themselves infinitely more brutal. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask if I was scared. He did not ask who was responsible. He looked at me with an expression of profound, bottomless contempt, as if I were a stranger who had just tracked filth into his pristine home, and he asked the question that would define the rest of my life. "How," he said, each word a chip of ice, "could you let this happen?" The question was a masterpiece of cruelty. In 7 words, he had absolved the world of any responsibility. He had erased my rapist, erased my circumstances, and placed the entire crushing weight of the sin squarely on my shoulders. It was not something that was done to me. It was something I had let happen. I was not the victim. I was the incompetent guardian of my own body and of the family's honor. My throat was thick with unshed tears, but I tried to answer, tried to give them the name, the one fact that mattered. It was Mr. and... "Stop!" My father's voice was a whip crack. He held up a hand, a sharp, brutal gesture that cut me off. "I don't want a name. Do you understand me?" A name makes it real. A name creates a narrative. A name is a complication this family cannot afford. He had just willingly, consciously, chosen ignorance. He didn't want the truth. The truth would require action, confrontation, a scandal that would tarnish his precious name. He wanted a problem he could manage, and an anonymous, slutty daughter was a far more manageable problem than a respected community leader who was a violent predator. The monster was to be granted anonymity, while I was to be given the full burden of the blame. The conversation, from that moment on, was no longer about me. It was about logistics. It was a corporate strategy session on disaster management. They spoke about me as if I were not in the room, referring to my condition as the situation, the problem, the mess. "How far along?" my father demanded. 3 months, maybe a little more," I whispered. My mother let out another strangled sob. "Oh, Richard, the town, her school. What will people say? The garden club, Eleanor Henderson. Oh God, our name will be mud." "Utter mud." She paced back and forth, wringing her hands, her dialogue a litany of social anxieties. She was a barometer of public opinion, and nothing more. "Helen, be quiet," my father commanded, not even looking at her. "Hysterics are a luxury we don't have time for." He turned his glacial gaze back to me. "Who else knows?" "No one," I said. "It will stay that way," he stated. It was not a request. It was an imperial decree. He leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together, the very picture of a man making a difficult but necessary executive decision. He was the judge, the jury, and now the executioner. He delivered the verdict. First, he began, as of tomorrow, you are no longer attending school. I will call the principal. We will say you have mononucleosis. It's believable. It requires a long period of convalescence and isolation. Your brother is not to be told the truth. He will be told you have mono, just like everyone else. His future is too important to be tainted by this sordid mess. My role as the sacrifice for the golden child was now official policy. Second, he continued, you will remain in this house until the end of the semester, mostly in your room. We can't risk anyone seeing you as the situation progresses. Third, as soon as the school year is over, you will be sent away. We will tell people you are going to spend the summer and the next semester with your Aunt Carol in California. In reality, you will be going to a private facility I will find, a discreet place. You will stay there until this problem is resolved. Resolved? I whispered, the word tasting like poison. His eyes were chips of flint. There will be no discussion of keeping it. That is not an option. It does not exist. The problem will be dealt with, and then you will return, and we will never speak of this again. This entire year will be erased. The sentence had been passed. I was to be isolated, exiled, and then surgically altered, my memory and my history rewritten by his decree. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Arguing with him would be like arguing with a landslide. The cold, flat resolve I had entered the room with had been shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a hollow, silent void. I had been completely and utterly dehumanized. They were not parents confronting their daughter's trauma. They were a corporate board managing a hostile takeover of my life. They looked at my pregnant body and did not see their daughter or their grandchild. They saw a liability, a threat to their social stock price. In that dark, wood-paneled room, they performed the final, most intimate act of violence. They erased me as their child and recast me as a problem to be liquidated. You are dismissed, my father said finally, turning his attention to a stack of papers on his desk, my existence already forgotten. I turned and walked out of the study, leaving them to the quiet, ghoulish work of plotting the logistics of my exile. I closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch sounding as final as a coffin lid closing. The family verdict had been delivered. My house was now my prison, my parents were my wardens, and I was on death row, waiting for the sentence to be carried out. The verdict had been delivered, and the sentence began immediately. My bedroom, once my only refuge, was officially redesignated as my cell. The lie of my mononucleosis was rolled out with chilling efficiency. My mother's phone calls were masterpieces of anxious, believable fiction. I would listen from the top of the stairs as she spoke to the school principal, her voice laced with a perfect blend of maternal concern and weary resignation. I heard her on the phone with her friends from the garden club, describing my supposed symptoms, the profound fatigue, the fever, the need for absolute rest and isolation, with the authority of a medical textbook. She was a brilliant actress. It occurred to me that her entire life had been a rehearsal for this single duplicitous performance. My brother, Mark, was told the lie and he accepted it without question. He looked at me with a sort of detached pity, the kind one reserves for a sick pet. "Tough break, Lily," he'd say from my doorway, careful not to come too close, as if my manufactured illness were actually contagious. "Guess you'll miss the spring formal." The triviality of his concern was a special kind of salt in the wound. He was worried about a dance. I was worried about the dissolution of my entire world. My life shrank to the four walls of my room. My meals appeared on a tray left outside my door, as if I were a leper. My parents rarely came in. When they did, they spoke to me with a new, terrifyingly polite distance. The anger was gone, replaced by a cool, administrative efficiency. They were no longer my parents. They were project managers, overseeing the final, difficult phase of a deeply unpleasant task. I was no longer their daughter. I was a piece of sensitive cargo, kept in a climate-controlled room, waiting for my transport date. In that profound isolation, my body continued its secret, relentless work. As my belly grew, I lived in baggy sweatshirts and my father's old flannel robes. I would stand before the mirror in the dead of night, tracing the new, firm curve of my abdomen. It was a strange and terrible intimacy. I would feel a flutter, a kick, a tiny, insistent life making its presence known. And in the silent darkness, a fierce, protective love, an emotion I thought had been permanently scoured from me, would rise up. It was a love with no future, a love I was forbidden to acknowledge. I would whisper to the growing life inside me, telling it stories, promising it things I knew I could not deliver. It was an act of desperate, futile motherhood, a love affair conducted in a tomb. The day the school year officially ended, my exile began. The departure was a clandestine operation, executed in the pre-dawn grayness. My father woke me before the sun was up. "It's time," he said, his voice a low command. There were no tearful goodbyes, no lingering hugs. My mother stood in the hallway, her face pale and strained, clutching her housecoat at her neck. She did not meet my eyes. She simply handed me a small suitcase, packed with loose-fitting, anonymous clothes she had bought for me. My father drove. The car was a capsule of suffocating silence. He did not turn on the radio. He did not speak. His eyes were fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He was a courier, and I was the package he was tasked with delivering. We drove for hours, leaving the lush, familiar green of western Oregon behind. The landscape flattened, browned, and emptied out. The rolling hills were replaced by vast, featureless plains under a bleached-out sky. The world outside the car became a reflection of my own internal state, desolate, hopeless, and stripped of all identifying features. Late in the afternoon, he turned off the main highway onto a cracked asphalt road. In the distance, a single, grim building stood alone, surrounded by a high fence. It was a 3-story structure of faded red brick, with narrow windows that looked like suspicious, squinting eyes. A small, discreet sign by the gate read, "St. Jude's Center for Women." It was a name that promised sanctuary and compassion, but the building itself promised only anonymity and shame. St. Jude's smelled of disinfectant, boiled vegetables, and quiet desperation. The walls were painted a pale, institutional green, the color of resignation. The floors were worn linoleum that squeaked under the sensible shoes of the staff. I was assigned to a room on the 2nd floor, a room I shared with another girl whose name I never learned. We were all ghosts there. 20 girls from 20 different towns, all with the same secret, all scrubbed of our pasts and our identities. We did not ask each other questions. We existed in a state of suspended animation, a gray limbo of waiting. The days were ruled by a monotonous, dehumanizing routine. We woke at 7. We ate our bland, timed meals in a silent refectory. We were assigned chores, laundry, kitchen duty, weeding the small, enclosed garden. There were mandatory counseling sessions with a woman whose smile never reached her cold, evaluative eyes. The sessions were not about our emotional well-being. They were about ensuring a smooth, guilt-free transition into signing the adoption papers. We were not there to be healed. We were there to be processed. Months passed. The pale green of the walls, the squeak of the floors, the silent faces of the other girls. This became my world. The baby inside me grew stronger, my body becoming a vessel for a life that was both mine and not mine. The love I felt for it was a fierce, secret fire I tended to in the lonely darkness of my bunk. I was a living paradox, nurturing a life I was destined to lose, my body a sanctuary for a child who would never know me as its mother. The end came on a hot, airless night in late August. The first contraction was a sharp, clenching fist deep inside me. The pain was a clarifying force, a brutal, physical reality that cut through the months of emotional numbness. This was real. This was happening. The process was lonely and clinical. There was no one to hold my hand, no one to whisper words of encouragement. There was only a starched, efficient nurse, a sterile delivery room, and the raw, overwhelming tide of pain. And then, after hours of struggle, she was born. For one perfect, transcendent moment, the world stopped. They laid her on my chest, a tiny, squirming, red-faced creature with a thatch of dark hair and a cry that was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I looked at her impossibly small fingers, her perfectly formed ears, and a wave of love so powerful, so primal, washed over me, cleansing me of the filth and shame of the past year. The moment was fleeting. "We need to clean her up and run some checks," the nurse said, her voice gentle but firm. She whisked my daughter away, and I knew with a certainty that was a fresh, sharp pain that it was the beginning of the end. I lay back on the bed, exhausted, bleeding, and utterly, completely empty. An hour later, the door to my room opened. It was my father. He must have been summoned the moment I went into labor. He was wearing a dark business suit and looked profoundly out of place in the sterile medical environment. He looked tired and impatient. He did not look at me. He did not ask how I was. His eyes scanned the room, deliberately avoiding the small, clear plastic bassinet in the corner where my daughter now lay sleeping, wrapped in a pink blanket. A moment later, a woman in a gray suit came in, carrying a clipboard. She was the administrator. She smiled at me, a brief, professional smile. "You must be very tired," she said before placing the clipboard on the rolling table over my bed. The adoption papers, the dense blocks of legal text, the empty lines waiting for my signature. My father moved to stand beside the bed, looming over me. "Sign it, Lily," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used to close a business deal. "Let's finish this." I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I looked at the line where my name was supposed to go. I looked over at the bassinet, at the perfect sleeping face of my child. Signing this paper was not an act of resolution. It was an act of profound, unspeakable violence against her and against the fierce, pure love I felt for her. But my father's cold, expectant gaze was on me. The weight of his will, of my mother's terror, of their entire world, was pressing down on that pen. With a sob that had no sound, I signed my name. Each letter was a betrayal. Each curve of the pen was an act of abandonment. As soon as the signature was complete, my father nodded, a curt gesture of satisfaction. The administrator took the clipboard. The transaction was complete. My father turned and walked to the door without another word. He never once glanced at the bassinet. He never once acknowledged the existence of his own grandchild, who lay sleeping just a few feet away. The problem had been resolved. The liability had been liquidated. He paused at the door, his back to me. "I'll be back in 2 days to take you home," he said, and then he was gone. I was alone. Alone in the silent antiseptic room, the smell of bleach sharp in my nostrils. My body was empty. My arms were empty. My life was empty. The silence in the room was a deafening roar. In that moment, I finally understood the full scope of my father's verdict. I was not his daughter. I was a vessel, a temporary container for a problem that had now been neatly and efficiently disposed of. He walked out of that room having erased his grandchild from our family's history, and in the process, he had erased what little was left of me. The girl who walked out of St. Jude's Center was a hollow shell, a human-shaped echo. She returned to Havenwood and played the part assigned to her. She finished high school with quiet, mediocre grades. She was the ghost at her own graduation. The lie of her mononucleosis had been so successful that people simply saw her as changed by illness, a little more fragile, a little more distant. It was a convenient explanation that allowed everyone, including her parents, to avoid looking any closer. Years turned into decades. The hollow space inside me never filled, but I learned to build a life around it, a fragile fortress of routine and silence. I married a quiet, kind man, a librarian who loved books more than people, and who asked few questions about the sadness he sometimes saw in my eyes. We never had children. I could not bear the thought. I lived a life of quiet adequacy, the memories of that year locked away in a part of my mind that I never visited. I was a survivor, but the war was never over. It was simply a cold war, waged in the silence of my own heart. And then, 50 years later, the phone call came, a patch of black ice on a winding road. A final, tidy end to the long, cold performance of my parents' marriage. After the funeral, after my brother Mark's clumsy attempts at consolation, the practicalities began. The house, that museum of our family's lies, had to be dismantled. Mark, ever the golden boy, and now a busy executive with a family of his own, was quickly overwhelmed. "Lily, would you mind?" He'd asked me over the phone, his voice strained. "Just sorting through things." "You were always the organized one." The irony of his words was a physical blow. I was the keeper of the family's greatest disorder, the chaos they had swept under the rug. But I agreed. I felt a strange, grim pull to the task. It was not a duty to them, but a final, private exorcism for myself. I needed to walk through the wreckage one last time, to touch the artifacts of my own destruction, and then to walk away forever. A week after the funeral, I let myself into the house on Maple Street. It was silent, preserved in a thin layer of dust. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of unspoken words and polished lies. I walked through the rooms, a tourist in the ruins of my own childhood. There was the living room, where my father had sat in his leather throne. There was the sunroom, where my mother had sealed my tomb. Every object, a silver picture frame, a porcelain figurine, a stack of perfectly folded napkins in a drawer, was a testament to their obsession with a perfect surface. I began my work methodically, clinically. I started in the kitchen, packing away my mother's china, her neatly handwritten recipe cards. Then the living room, boxing up books and trinkets. It was a melancholy task, but the sadness was familiar, a well-worn coat I had been wearing for 50 years. Finally, only one room was left. The study, my father's command center. Stepping into that room was like stepping back in time. The air was still heavy with his cold authority. I could almost see him behind the great mahogany desk, his face a mask of disappointment. I felt like a trespasser, a child who had wandered into the king's forbidden chamber. But I was not a child anymore. I was an old woman, and the king was dead. I began with his desk, sorting through the meticulously ordered contents. Financial statements, membership cards for the country club, correspondence about municipal bonds. It was the paper trail of a successful, respectable man. It was the architecture of the myth. Behind a large framed painting of a hunting scene, I found what I knew was there, the dark green door of a wall safe. Mark had found the combination written on a card in our father's wallet and given it to me over the phone. "Probably just some stock certificates and Mom's old jewelry," he'd said, his voice bored. "Just put it all in a box for the lawyer." My fingers, stiff with age, fumbled with the dial. The soft clicks as the tumblers fell into place were loud in the silent room. A final heavy thunk and the thick steel door swung open. Inside, it was just as Mark had predicted, neat stacks of stock certificates, property deeds. A velvet bag containing my mother's pearl necklace. It was all so predictable, so honorable. I gathered the items, my task nearly complete. As I was about to close the heavy door, my fingers brushed against the felt-lined back of the safe. It gave, just slightly, a ripple under the fabric. A feeling I hadn't experienced in decades flickered to life. Curiosity. I pressed again, harder this time. There was a faint click, and a section of the back panel came loose. It was a hidden compartment, no bigger than a shoebox. My heart, a slow and steady drum for 50 years, began to beat a little faster. I reached inside and my fingers closed around a small polished wooden box. It looked like an old humidor. It did not belong with the stocks and deeds. It felt secret. I took the box to the desk and sat in my father's chair. The leather sighed under my weight. I ran my hands over the smooth, dark wood of the box before lifting the lid. There was no money inside, no hidden jewels. There was only a single neat bundle of letters tied with a faded, brittle silk ribbon. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon. The paper was old, the ink slightly faded. The first letter I unfolded was in my father's sharp, aggressive handwriting. It was addressed to Mr. David Anderson. The date on it was from the spring of my 16th year, months before the tutoring sessions had even begun. My blood went cold. Why was my father writing to my English teacher? I began to read. The letter was terse, formal. It spoke of a temporary financial difficulty and the importance of professional discretion. It was unsettlingly vague. The next letter was Anderson's reply. The handwriting was a stark contrast to my father's, a smooth, elegant, confident script. The tone was not that of a teacher, but of a predator who knows he has his prey cornered. He made a casual reference to a recent audit of my father's accounting firm, and then he mentioned a specific client account, a numbered account, and a discrepancy. And then I saw the word, embezzlement. Anderson wrote that he had come across some documents quite by accident, and that he was sure my father would want to avoid any unpleasant misunderstandings. The first bomb had detonated. My father, Richard Quinn, the pillar of the community, the man of honor, was a common thief. I felt a wave of dizziness, but I kept reading. The next letter was from my father, the sharp handwriting now shaky, frantic. He was pleading. He offered money, a staggering sum, for Anderson's silence. He would do anything, he wrote, to protect his name, his family. And then I came to the last letter. It was from Anderson. It was the invoice. It was the bill of sale for my soul. "My dear Richard," it began, the salutation dripping with a smug, false intimacy. "Money is so uninteresting, don't you think? It comes and goes. What I truly value are the finer things in life, an appreciation for beauty, for potential. Your daughter, Lily, is a truly remarkable young woman, so intelligent, so receptive. I have taken a special interest in her education, as you know. I believe with the right guidance, she could achieve great things." I had to stop, my breath catching in my throat. I forced myself to read the final, monstrous paragraph. "Let us be of service to one another, Richard. You ensure that my mentorship of your daughter continues. Ensure that it is private, uninterrupted, and that no one, especially not your anxious wife, interferes with the special bond I intend to foster with her. You guarantee me this access, and I will guarantee you my complete and utter silence regarding your financial indiscretions. I trust we have an understanding." The world did not tilt. It shattered. The air was punched from my lungs. The entire history of my life, a story I thought I knew, was a lie. The narrative I had constructed, a story of parental cowardice, of a desperate obsession with social standing, was a pale, pathetic shadow of the truth. My mother's panicked denial when I tried to tell her. My father's cold, focused rage, his violent refusal to hear Anderson's name. It wasn't about protecting the family honor from a scandal I had caused. It was about protecting themselves from a secret they had kept. It was about upholding their end of a filthy, monstrous bargain. My abuse wasn't a secret they were forced to keep. It was a transaction they had willingly made. I was not a casualty of their weakness. I was the currency. My body, my innocence, my future. It was the price they paid to a blackmailer to keep my father out of prison and his precious name out of the mud. I sat there in the deafening silence of my father's study, the devil's correspondence in my hand, and a strange thing happened. The grief I had carried for 50 years, the hollow ache for the parents I never had, was burned away. It vanished, incinerated in a flash of pure, white-hot rage. But it was not the hot, useless rage of a victim. It was a cold, crystalline fury, the fury of a debt collector who has just discovered the true, staggering scale of what she is owed. I looked at the letters, so neatly preserved. They were not a tragedy. They were a weapon. My story was not over. It had been a long, bleak prologue. The real story, the one about the reckoning, was just beginning. I carefully folded the letters, placed them back in their box, and tied the ribbon. The grieving daughter was dead. The hollowed-out ghost was gone. In their place sat someone else, someone much colder, much stronger, and with a terrifying new clarity of purpose. I had come to this house to perform an exorcism. I would leave it to begin a hunt. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark of my own quiet home, the small wooden box on the table in front of me, a silent, malevolent companion. The fury did not dissipate with the coming of the dawn. It solidified. It settled deep into my bones, a new kind of marrow, cold and diamond-hard. The grief I had mistaken for my life's companion had been a ghost all along. This rage, this was real. It was a living thing. I walked out of my father's house on Maple Street the next morning and did not look back. I drove not to my own home, but to the bank in the center of town. There, With the calm precision of a spy, I rented a safe deposit box. I placed the humidor inside the cool, dark steel drawer next to the small portfolio of stocks my grandmother had left me. That inheritance, a sum I had never touched, had been bequeathed with a cryptic handwritten note. For a truly rainy day, Lily girl. Or for when you need to build your own damn house. My grandmother, a woman with sharp, knowing eyes and a deep, unspoken distrust of my father's polished charm, had given me the means for my reckoning 50 years before it began. The letters were now my weapon, and she had provided the war chest. My first task was to find a general. Not just any lawyer, not someone who would speak to me in hushed, sympathetic tones about trauma and statutes of limitation. I needed a warrior. I spent the next 3 days in the quiet of the public library, not my late husband's, but one in a larger city, poring over legal journals and news archives on their public computers. I was not looking for a firm that handled wills and estates. I was looking for a name that appeared next to words like relentless, unflinching, precedent-setting. I was looking for a lioness. And then I found her, Eleanor Vance, a partner at one of Portland's most formidable law firms. Her case history was a trail of vanquished corporate giants and disgraced public figures. She was known for taking on complex, high-stakes cases, for her ferocious cross-examinations, and for a client list that was notoriously difficult to get onto. She was perfect. Getting the appointment was the first battle. Her secretary was a polite, ironclad fortress, trained to repel all but the most powerful supplicants. She listened to my name and my request for a consultation with cool disinterest. "And the nature of your business with Ms. Vance?" she'd asked, her tone implying she had better things to do. I paused, then spoke with a clarity that surprised even myself. "You can tell her it concerns a man named David Anderson, from Havenwood." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I had dropped the name like a stone into a still pond. The ripples, I knew, would be interesting. I was given an appointment for the following week. The law firm of Vance Holloway Stern occupied the top 2 floors of a glass and steel skyscraper that pierced the Portland sky. It was a world of hushed power, of muted grays and gleaming chrome. It was designed to intimidate, to communicate in no uncertain terms that the people who worked here did not lose. I, an 80-year-old woman in a simple black dress, should have felt out of place. I did not. I felt as if I had finally arrived on the correct battlefield. Eleanor Vance was exactly as I had pictured her. She was a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps late 40s, dressed in a sharply tailored suit the color of smoke. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant knot, and her eyes, behind a pair of minimalist glasses, were the most intelligent and perceptive I had ever seen. They missed nothing. She greeted me politely, her handshake firm, and gestured for me to sit in one of the 2 leather chairs opposite her vast, empty glass desk. "Mrs. Quinn," she began, her voice as crisp and cool as the room around her. "My assistant said your query was of a sensitive nature. How can I help you?" She expected a dispute over my parents' will, perhaps a contested property line. I was about to give her the case of her life. I did not cry. I did not falter. I sat straight in my chair and, with the cold, chronological precision of a historian delivering a lecture, I told her my story. I started with the tutoring sessions, the slow, methodical grooming. I spoke of the abuse, of my pregnancy, of the conversation in the sunroom with my mother. I told her of the exile to Sainty. Jude's, of the birth of my daughter, of my father's presence at the signing of the adoption papers. As I spoke, I watched her. Her professional mask remained perfectly in place, but I saw a subtle shift in her eyes, a tightening around her mouth. She was listening. When I finished that part of the story, she was silent for a long moment. She steepled her fingers, her gaze steady. "Lily," she said, her use of my first name a small, calculated offering of empathy, "that is a horrific story, and I believe every word of it. However, from a legal standpoint, the challenges are immense. The statute of limitations on these crimes ran out decades ago. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, any legal action would be your word against his. It would be incredibly difficult and painful." I let her finish. I had expected this. This was the professional, responsible answer. Then I leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Vance," I said, my voice low and firm. That was the context. It is not why I am here. I told her about clearing out the study, about the safe, about the hidden compartment and the small wooden box. And then I began to recite the contents of the letters, quoting key phrases from memory. I spoke of my father's embezzlement. I spoke of Anderson's discovery. I spoke of the final monstrous letter, the one that rejected money and instead demanded access to me, the one that mentioned his special bond and warned my father to ensure no one interferes. As I spoke, I watched the transformation of Eleanor Vance. The professional mask did not just crack, it shattered. Her eyes, once merely perceptive, now blazed with a fierce, predatory light. The blood had risen in her cheeks. This was no longer a sad, unprovable story of historic abuse. This was a documented, cold-blooded conspiracy. This was a case, a monster of a case. She was silent for a full minute after I finished, her mind clearly working at lightning speed. Finally, she looked at me, all pretense of professional distance gone. "My God," she whispered. Then her voice became sharp, focused. "Mrs. Quinn, Lily, what is it you want? What is the desired outcome here?" She was already thinking of lawsuits, of damages, of the vast sums of money that could be extracted from my parents' estate and from David Anderson. I met her fiery gaze with my own icy calm. "I don't want money, Ms. Vance. My parents' estate is an inheritance of filth, and Mr. Anderson's money is irrelevant to me. Money is a settlement. I am not here to settle." I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. "I am here for a reckoning." "Define reckoning," she said, her voice a challenge. "First," I began, ticking the points off on my fingers, "I want the truth to be known. All of it. The story of what he did to me, and the documented story of the bargain my parents made to allow it to happen. Second, I want his legacy dismantled. He is a revered figure in Havenwood. The David Anderson Reading Room at the library. The Community Service Awards, the reputation he built on my silence and my family's complicity, I want it all turned to ash. I want every person in that town who ever called him a saint to know that they were worshiping a devil." I took a breath. The third point was the hardest, the first crack in my own icy armor. "And I want to find my daughter." The words were a quiet admission of the 50-year-old ache that lived beneath the rage. "I know I have no legal right to her. I signed the papers, but I want to know that she's had a good life. I want her to have the option of knowing the truth, if she so chooses." Eleanor Vance stared at me, her expression a mixture of awe and ferocious determination. She was in. She was all in. "Criminal charges will be impossible, as I said," she began, already thinking out loud, her voice humming with energy. "But this is a case for the court of public opinion. The letters are dynamite." "Absolute dynamite. He could sue for defamation, but we would meet that with the truth as our defense. It would be a public crucifixion." She leaned forward, a grim, excited smile on her lips. "To do this right, we need more than just the letters. We need to know everything about Anderson's life since then. About your father's finances and about the adoption. We need the best private investigator I know." She reached for her phone. A new alliance was being forged in this glass tower, an alliance of cold fury and brilliant legal strategy. "This will be a very difficult, very public fight, Lily," Eleanor Vance said, her eyes holding mine. "I have had 50 years of difficult," I replied. "I'm ready for something else." She nodded, then made the call. "Sarah, get me Marcus Thorne on the line," she said into the receiver. "Tell him I have something for him." "It's big. Tell him to clear his schedule. We're starting the Havenwood project." I walked out of that glass and steel tower and back into the afternoon sunlight. The air felt different, charged with a new electricity. For the first time since I was a 16-year-old girl, I was not alone in my fight. The ghost had found her attorney. But more than that, she had found her voice, and we were about to begin a very different and very deadly kind of correspondence. The months that followed my meeting with Eleanor Vance were a quiet, steady hum of activity, a gathering of armies for a war that only we knew was coming. The Havenwood project, as Eleanor called it, was in full swing. Our general had deployed her best field commander, a private investigator named Marcus Thorne. He was a quiet, unassuming man who moved through the world without leaving a ripple, the perfect ghost to haunt the man who had made me one. Thorne descended upon Havenwood, and, for weeks, became a part of its scenery. He drank coffee at the local diner, read papers in the park, and slowly, meticulously, mapped out the life and habits of Mr. David Anderson. The reports that came back to us were a portrait of revered old age. Anderson, now in his late 80s, was Havenwood's most celebrated citizen. He was a widower, his fictional wife, Catherine, having been replaced by a real one who had died a decade prior. He lived in a historic house on the town's most prestigious street. He took a constitutional walk every morning at 10, attended Rotary Club lunches on Wednesdays, and spent most afternoons at the public library, in the reading room that bore his name. He was a living monument, casting a long, honorable shadow over the town. Thorne's investigation, guided by Eleanor's sharp legal instincts, unearthed two crucial pieces of our arsenal. The first was a woman named Clara. She was in her late 50s, a quiet art teacher living 2 states away. Her name had come up in an old high school yearbook as another of Anderson's special protégés, a few years after my time. The approach was delicate. At first she was terrified, the memory a locked room she had not entered for 40 years. But when Eleanor, with my permission, shared the outlines of my story and the existence of the letters, the lock on Clara's own door broke. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, weary anger. She agreed to be there. She would be my corroborating witness. The second discovery was the one that stopped my heart. Through a series of legal petitions that Eleanor Vance pursued with relentless ferocity, they had managed to unseal the records from the long-defunct saint. Jude sent her, and there, in faded ink on a brittle piece of paper, was a name. My daughter. Her name is Dawn. She had been adopted by a loving couple. She was 51 years old, a successful architect, a mother herself, living in Colorado. Eleanor gave me the file. I sat for a full day, just looking at the single photograph Thorne had managed to acquire, a recent one from a professional website. She had my eyes. The rage that had become my constant companion for months receded for a moment, replaced by a wave of grief and longing so profound it almost brought me to my knees. The hollow space inside me, the one I had lived with for half a century, now had a face. Eleanor made the first contact, a carefully worded letter from a lawyer explaining a delicate family matter. Then, I spoke to her on the phone. The conversation was stilted, awkward, a 50-year chasm of silence separating us. I did not ask for forgiveness. I did not ask for a relationship. I simply, factually told her the truth of her own origin story. I told her what I was planning to do and why. I wanted you to know, I said, my voice thick with the things I couldn't say. And if you wish to be there to see the man whose actions set both of our lives on their courses, the door is open. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, yes. I'll be there. She was not coming for me. She was coming for herself. The day of the reckoning was a cool, clear Tuesday in October. I drove to Havenwood alone. The town, seen now through the lens of the absolute truth, was a grotesque parody of itself. The quaint, welcoming storefronts looked like painted masks. The white picket fences were the bars of 100 hidden cages. I was not a returning victim. I was a judge, arriving to pass sentence. The Havenwood Public Library was just as I remembered it, a stately brick building that smelled of old paper and quiet dignity, and there, carved in elegant letters into the dark wood lintel above the main reading room, were the words, "The David Anderson Reading Room." The irony was so perfect, so potent, it was almost poetic. I entered first. The room was quiet, with a handful of patrons scattered among the tables. I chose a round table in the center of the room, directly beneath the sign that bore his name. I sat down, my back straight, and placed my handbag on the table. A few minutes later, Clara came in and sat at a table near the history section, a book open in front of her. Then Eleanor, dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit, sat near the periodicals, looking for all the world like a woman browse a magazine on her lunch break. The trap was set. He arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, just as Thorne's report had predicted. He had aged, of course. He was stooped with age, his walk slow and careful, but he still carried himself with that old air of unearned self-importance. He nodded graciously to the librarian, who beamed at him with adoration. He was a king surveying his quiet kingdom. He saw me, an elegant, unfamiliar old woman sitting alone, and his programming kicked in. The charm, the practiced warmth, was a reflex. He approached my table with a gentle, grandfatherly smile. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice a little thinner, a little rustier, but still resonant with that old, false sincerity. "It's a lovely day for a read, isn't it?" He had absolutely no idea who I was. The feeling of power that washed over me was dizzying. I had been invisible to him for 50 years, and now my anonymity was my greatest weapon. I offered him a small, cold smile. "Mr. Anderson, how good of you to join me. I was hoping I might have a word." "Please, sit." I gestured to the chair opposite me. Puzzled but polite, he did as he was told. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "We have," I replied softly. "A long time ago. My name is Lily Quinn." The name meant nothing to him. A flicker of polite confusion, nothing more. He had destroyed hundreds of lives, ruined dozens of girls. I was just one of many. "All right, Lily Quinn," he said with a patronizing warmth. "What can I do for you?" I reached into my handbag and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was a pristine, high-quality copy of his final letter to my father. The one where he rejected money and demanded access. He picked it up, his smile still in place. I watched his eyes scan the first line. The smile faltered. I watched as he read the words, "My dear Richard," and his brow furrowed. I watched as he read the part about his special bond and his warning that no one interferes. And then I watched as 50 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled to dust in the space of 10 seconds. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. The grandfatherly mask melted away, revealing the terrified, cornered animal beneath. His hand began to shake. Where did you get this?" he stammered, his voice a dry rasp. Before I could answer, a second blow fell. From across the room, Clara stood up and walked to our table. She stood beside me, her hands clasped in front of her to still their trembling. "Hello, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You probably don't remember me either." I was Clara Jensen, English class, 1981. His head snapped up to look at her, his eyes wide with a new, dawning wave of panic. This wasn't just one ghost from his past. It was two. He was being haunted in stereo. And then, the final, decisive blow. As if on cue, the main doors of the library opened, and a woman with my dark hair and my eyes, a woman who radiated a quiet, formidable confidence, walked in. It was Dawn. She walked directly to our table, her gaze unwavering. She looked at the pathetic, crumbling old man in the chair. Then she looked at me. Her voice was quiet, but it carried with perfect clarity through the silent room. "I was told you wanted to meet me," she said, her words directed at Anderson. Then she sat down in the third chair at our table, looked directly at him, and delivered the line that sealed his fate. "I'm the daughter my mother was forced to give away." The trap had sprung. He was surrounded. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I leaned forward, my voice no louder than a whisper, but it was the whisper of a guillotine blade descending. "You blackmailed my father, Richard Quinn," I began, my voice a calm, clinical recitation of facts. "You used his crime to gain access to me. You assaulted me for months. When I became pregnant with your child," I gestured to Dawn, "my parents, at your insistence, hid me away. They sent me to a place called St. Jude's. This woman," I gestured to Dawn again, "is the problem my father paid you to create, and then paid to have resolved." He began to sputter, to push his chair back, a desperate, trapped animal looking for an escape. I delivered the final turn of the screw. "Copies of the letters you see here," I said, my voice cutting through his panicked noises, along with a full notarized statement from myself and a corroborating statement from Clara, were sent by my attorney this morning via courier to the district attorney's office and to the editor of the Havenwood Chronicle. The story of our town's living saint and his sordid little bargain will be on the front page of the paper by the end of the week. This reading room, Mr. Anderson, your name, your legacy, it's over. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet, total implosion. The revered public figure, the charming old man, the intellectual giant, all of it dissolved, leaving behind a shrunken, terrified, pathetic old man, gasping for air in the ruins of his own life. I stood up. Clara stood up. Dawn stood up. We did not say another word. We did not need to. We turned, and together, the three of us walked away, leaving him sitting alone, a living ghost in the room that bore his name, a name that would soon be synonymous with nothing but filth and shame. We walked out of the library and into the bright, clean light of the afternoon sun. I did not look back. There was no need. The reckoning was not the sound of a scream, but the quiet, devastating whisper of a long-buried truth in a hallowed room. He had built his life and legacy on my silence. It was only fitting that my words would be the thing to unmake him. The ghost, after 50 long years, had finally served the eviction notice. We did not stay to watch the aftershocks. After walking out of the library, the three of us, the ghost, the corroborating witness, and the living proof, drove to a small, anonymous diner in the next town over. We sat in a worn vinyl booth under the hum of a fluorescent light, a strange and silent trinity. There were no words for the occasion. What do you say? Congratulations on the successful demolition of a man's life? We ate pancakes in a quiet, shared understanding. For Clara and me, it was the end of a 40-year haunting. For Dawn, it was the beginning of a story she was only just learning how to read. We parted ways in the diner's parking lot, not with hugs or promises, but with a simple, profound nod of mutual acknowledgement. The alliance had served its purpose. I retreated to my quiet home and waited. The fuse had been lit. The detonation occurred exactly 3 days later, on a Friday. The front page of the Havenwood Chronicle, a paper usually filled with stories about high school football games and bake sales, was dominated by a single, stark headline: Havenwood's living legend, a secret life of blackmail and abuse. The article itself was a masterpiece of Eleanor Vance's calculated precision. It was not sensationalist. It was factual, clinical, and all the more devastating for it. It laid out the timeline, quoted key, damning phrases from the letters, and included a brief, professional statement from Eleanor confirming her representation of multiple clients in the matter. It mentioned my name, Clara's initials, and the existence of a child born of the abuse. It did not print a copy of a letter, holding that back as a strategic second blow. The story was so thoroughly, so authoritatively reported that it was impossible to dismiss. The bomb had gone off, and the fallout began immediately. As Eleanor had predicted, the first reaction from Havenwood's old guard was a fierce, protective denial. The paper was flooded with letters to the editor. The phone-in shows on the local radio station were filled with furious voices defending Anderson. It's a vicious lie, a money grab, a vendetta from some unstable woman. They circled the wagons around their town saint, their collective identity so intertwined with his that an attack on him was an attack on Havenwood itself. The tipping point came the following Tuesday. In its next edition, the Chronicle, responding to the public outcry, printed a high-resolution, scanned image of the final letter. The one where Anderson rejected money and demanded access. There it was, in his own elegant, undeniable handwriting. The physical evidence. The town's furious denial collapsed into a horrified, shamed silence. The dismantling of his legacy was swift and brutal. The library board convened an emergency meeting on a Wednesday night. The next morning, before the sun was up, a workman with a crowbar unceremoniously pried the carved wooden letters spelling the David Anderson Reading Room from the wall. They were dumped in a trash can behind the building. The Rotary Club, in a terse press release, announced the immediate revocation of his Man of the Year award from 1995. The City Council, in a panicked session, voted unanimously to rename the small park that had been dedicated to him and his late wife. It was now simply Oak Park. In the space of a week, David Anderson was systematically erased from the public history of the town he had dominated for 60 years. He became a non-person, a ghost in his own stately home, a prisoner of the shame he had so expertly crafted for me. But the fall of David Anderson was only half of the story. The other half was the fall of the House of Quinn. And that reckoning arrived with a furious phone call from my brother. "Lily, what have you done?" he roared, his voice, which I hadn't heard in months, thick with rage. "What in God's name have you done to this family?" "I've told the truth, Mark," I said calmly. "The truth?" he sputtered. "You've dragged our parents' names through the mud. They're not here to defend themselves. You've destroyed their memory for what? For some 50-year-old grudge? Meet me," I said. "Tomorrow. The coffee shop off the interstate at exit 42, 10 o'clock. I hung up before he could argue. He was there when I arrived, pacing back and forth in front of the shop, his face a mask of fury and anguish. We sat at a small table in a corner, the air between us crackling with his rage. He was the golden boy, his shine now tarnished by a scandal he couldn't comprehend. His entire identity, his sense of self, had been built upon the bedrock of the honorable Quinn family. I had just dynamited his foundation. "How could you, Lily?" he began, his voice low and shaking. "Our father was a great man. An honorable man. Our mother was a good woman. You've made them out to be monsters." "They were monsters, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "They were just very well-dressed, very polite monsters." "That's not true," he insisted, his fist clenched on the table. "They loved us. They gave us everything." "They gave you everything," I corrected him gently. "They gave me to him," his face contorted in disbelief. "You're twisting it. You were a difficult, moody teenager." "They were worried about you. He trailed off, unable to finish because he was trying to construct a lie he no longer fully believed himself. "Their legacy was a lie, Mark," I said, my voice still quiet. "It was a lie they built on top of my life. I didn't destroy their memory. I revealed it." "There's a difference." He shook his head, looking at me as if I were a stranger, a venomous creature he had never met. "I don't believe you. I'll never believe you." "You're doing this out of spite." I reached into my handbag and pulled out a slim manila envelope. Inside were pristine copies of the 4 letters. I slid the envelope across the table. It landed softly between our coffee cups. "Then don't believe me," I said. "Believe him. Believe our honorable father. Read them." He looked at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with a shaking hand, he opened the clasp and pulled out the papers. He began to read. I watched his face. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The blustering anger drained away first, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. As he read the second letter, the one that named the crime of embezzlement, his face went pale. When he reached the final letter, the one with the bargain, the one that sold me, I saw him stop breathing for a moment. He read it once, then again, his eyes scanning the elegant, damning script, as if trying to force the words to rearrange themselves into something less monstrous. He looked up at me. The golden boy was gone. The fury was gone. In their place was a sick, horrified, and utterly broken man. The father he had idolized, the man whose approval he had spent his entire life chasing, had not just been a liar. He had been a common thief who had sold his own sister to save himself. His entire life, his football trophies, his business success, his place in the world. He now understood, in one soul-crushing moment, that all of it had been financed by my suffering. "No," he whispered, the word a puff of empty air. "It's not." "It is, Mark," I said softly. "It always was." He just sat there, staring at the letters, his life's narrative in ashes on the table in front of him. There was nothing more to say. The truth had done its work. He was now the sole heir to a legacy, not of honor, but of profound and unforgivable shame. I left him there in the coffee shop, a stranger sifting through the wreckage of his own identity. As I drove away, I felt a profound sense of quiet. The rage was gone, the fury spent. The reckonings were complete. The monster of Havenwood was a disgraced pariah. My parents' false legacy was a pile of ash. And my brother, the sun around which our family had always orbited, had finally been forced to see the darkness that had fueled his light. My parents had spent their lives worshiping at the altar of reputation. It was a fitting and terrible irony that in the end, the truth had burned their church to the ground. For me, the war was finally over. The ghosts had been vanquished, and in the silence that followed, a silence that was not empty and hollow but peaceful and clean, I began to hear a new sound, the sound of my own name, spoken in my own voice, free at last. The great, furious storm had passed. In the weeks that followed the collapse of Havenwood's monuments, a new kind of silence settled over my life. It was not the suffocating, watchful silence of my childhood, nor the hollow, aching silence of my middle years. This was a clean silence. It was the quiet of a field after a fire, the ground blackened and sterile, but open to the sun, ready for new, more honest things to grow. The phone stopped ringing with updates from Eleanor. The newspapers moved on to other, fresher scandals. The rage that had been my fuel for months had burned itself out, leaving behind not ash, but a profound and gentle quiet. I was tired, but it was the clean exhaustion that comes after a long and necessary labor. I would wake in the morning, and for the first time in my memory, the only person I had to be was myself. Then, one Tuesday, the phone rang. It was Dawn. Her voice was hesitant, careful. "I was thinking," she said. "I have to be in Portland for a consultation next week. I was thinking I might drive down to see you afterwards. If that's all right." If that's all right. The simple courtesy of the question was a gift in itself. A lifetime of decisions had been made for me, about me, without my consent. This small question was a recognition of my autonomy, of me. "Yes," I said, my voice catching slightly. "Yes, Dawn. That would be more than all right." The days leading up to her visit were filled with a strange, nervous energy. I, who had not hosted a guest in years, found myself fussing over small maternal details. I baked oatmeal cookies from a recipe I hadn't used in 3 decades. I went to 3 different stores to find the specific brand of Earl Grey tea I'd overheard her mention she liked during our one stilted meal together. These were the small, clumsy gestures of a woman trying to learn a language she had never been taught, the language of motherhood. I was trying to build a welcome mat for a daughter I was only just beginning to know. When her car, a sensible, modern sedan, pulled into my driveway, I stood at the window, my heart aflutter like a trapped bird. She got out of the car and stood for a moment, looking at my small house, at the garden I had so carefully tended. She was a stranger, this woman who had grown inside my own body. We were 2 points on a map, separated by 50 years of distance, connected only by a single, violent secret. Our hug at the front door was brief, stiff, an uncertain collision of 2 worlds. We sat in my living room, a room filled with my books, my worn armchair, my life. It was the antithesis of my parents' performative, perfect house. It was real. The conversation began with the careful, polite maneuvering of 2 diplomats from warring nations. We spoke of the weather. We spoke of the drive from Portland. She, an architect, commented on the structural integrity of my old house. I, a gardener, spoke of my struggles with aphids on the roses. We were circling the great, unspoken continent of our past, each afraid to set foot on its shores. We did not speak of Anderson. We did not speak of my parents. The reckoning was over. The bodies had been buried. To speak of it now would feel like a desecration of this new, fragile peace, and so we spoke of everything else. Gently, cautiously, she began to fill in the 50-year gap. She spoke of her adoptive parents, a professor and a musician, who had given her a life filled with books, music, and unconditional love. She spoke of her own children, a son in college and a daughter just finishing high school. As she spoke, I listened with an intensity that was almost painful. I was not just listening to her words, I was greedily absorbing the details of the life I had been forced to give away. A life that had, against all odds, been a happy one. It was the greatest, most profound relief of my existence. In turn, I shared pieces of myself, not the ghost, but the woman who had survived. I spoke of my late husband, the quiet librarian who had given me a life of gentle companionship. I showed her my garden, pointing out the stubborn peonies and the fragrant lavender. We were two women, sharing the quiet outlines of our separate lives, lives that should have been intertwined. The moment that the ice finally cracked came unexpectedly. We were sitting at my kitchen table, sipping tea. She looked past me, at the overflowing bookshelf in the corner. "Is that a first edition of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own?" she asked, a spark of genuine excitement in her eyes. "It is," I said, surprised. "It was my husband's wedding gift to me." "It's my favorite," she said, a slow, wondering smile spreading across her face. "I wrote my thesis on it in college." And there it was. A flicker of connection. A shared love for a book about a woman's need for a space of her own. A genetic inheritance of the soul, passed down through a wall of silence and time. In that moment, she was not just the architect, the mother, the stranger. She was a woman who loved the same words I did. She was, in some small, undeniable way, mine. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, I brought out a box. From it, I took a new photo album. Its leather cover was smooth and unblemished. Its pages were thick, white, and completely, beautifully empty. I placed it on the table between us. My parents' photo albums were filled with performances, I said quietly. Every smile was posed, every occasion was a statement. I thought, perhaps we could start a new one. A more honest one. She looked at the blank book, and I saw tears well in her eyes for the first time. She simply nodded. I didn't have a photograph to put in it. Not yet. Instead, I opened a heavy book of poetry from my shelf and took out a single, perfectly pressed lavender blossom I had placed there months ago. I laid it carefully on the center of the first page. "From my garden," I said. "It's a start." Dawn watched me. Then she reached into her own purse. She took out her professional business card. In elegant, simple font, it read, "Dawn Matthews, Architect." She took the card and placed it on the page just below the lavender blossom. Her life's work next to mine. Our two separate worlds finally touching on a single page. Her visit came to an end. The goodbye was still a little awkward, but it was warmer this time. A quick, less hesitant hug, a promise to call, the possibility of a future. After she drove away, I stood in my quiet house, holding the teacup she had used, its rim still faintly marked by her lipstick. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden, at the setting sun casting a long, golden light over the flowers. And then, a strange and unfamiliar sensation. A warmth spreading from my chest outwards, a gentle upward curve of my lips, a smile. It was not the smile of triumph. It was not the smile of victory or revenge. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. The war was over, the ghosts were gone, and a new, fragile, and deeply precious seed had been planted in the clean, quiet earth. For 50 years, I was a secret, a ghost, a bargain. My name was a word to be whispered in a shameful room. But the story is no longer his to tell or theirs to hide. It is mine. My revenge wasn't a storm of fire. It was the quiet turn of a key, opening a door that had been locked my whole life. And on the other side, I did not find a perfect, happy ending from a storybook. I found something smaller and infinitely more precious. I found a beginning. A quiet dawn, and I found my name, the one that has always, truly been mine. My name is Lily.